Hello and welcome to this episode of Superhero Ethics. Fans, as you know, I love superheroes not just because the fight scenes are fun or the great outfits. That can be fun. But what I love is the mental, ethical, psychological questions that are raised by asking, what happens in a world of superheroes? Well, my personal favorite thing to do on this podcast is to get much smarter people on who've done even more thinking about these questions than I have and get to talk to them. And I have today a real treat. Two authors who are both therapists and have written or have together edited a book called Supes Ain't Always Heroes, with a particular focus on the TV show The Boys. And we're going to be talking with both of them about it. And so let me just start by letting the two of them introduce themselves. Lynn, why don't you go first?
Hi, I'm Dr. Lynn Zubernis. I'm a clinical psychologist and a professor at Westchester University, and my main area of research is actually the psychology of being a fan. So I've done a lot of research on why that's really a good thing for a lot of us in many ways, and I've written a bunch of books on my favorite shows that I'm a fan of, many on Supernatural, and most recently this one on The Boys.
I notice a common theme between those two of Mr. Jensen Ackles that we'll be discussing quite a bit today. And Dr. Snyder, how about yourself? Matthew?
Yeah, hi. My name's Dr. Matt Snyder. I am a professor at Westchester University as well, and also have a private practice where I have a therapy group that I work with. And I think what kind of drew me to this, besides, Lynn grabbing me, kicking and screaming, was the fact that I just started watching The Boys after she said, you have to watch this. And just the common human themes, the human dilemmas really spoke to me, and the depth of the characters, but also like the clinical issues that they were going through that, in a very fantastical way, my clients were going through the same things. Of course, they weren't, flying through buildings and things like that, but all the things that I think, these great characters struggled with are what my clients struggle with on a day-to-day basis.
And I love hearing that. A theme we talk about in this podcast all the time is that some of our favorite stories are the ones where either that they are metaphors for what, is happening in our real life, or it's just that they are, as you said, kind of like, Spider-Man's dealing with, issues of familial guilt and abandonment, just in much different ways. Iron Man is constantly dealing with issues with his father and stuff like that. And so let's talk about why The Boys. There's so much content out there right now about superheroes and super powered people, because we're going to talk a lot about what makes a hero or not. Why The Boys?
I mean, for me, I started watching it actually not because of Jensen Ackles, because he wasn't on it yet, but because of Eric Kripke, who is one of my favorite creative minds. I will give anything Eric Kripke puts his creative touch to a try. Maybe I won't fall in love with it. Maybe I will. In the case of Supernatural and The Boys, I did. I think this is an adapted story, of course, from the comics graphic novels, but he tends to find the things and want to tell the stories that really draw me in and really speak to me. Supernatural certainly did that. It told a very different story than most other media was telling at the time. And I think The Boys does too, by looking at superheroes and really dissecting how they are not always heroes at all, lets us look at what it really means to be a superhero, why we as people need to look to heroes, what we get from that, and then ultimately how, in this case, they are also humans struggling with the same things that we're struggling with. So I really felt like The Boys takes a really unique and really unflinching look at real life things that are going on right now that I'm seeing all around me every day and are horrified at by sometimes. And it puts them on my screen in a way that I can say, oh, okay, thank God somebody else sees it too. It's validating to look at this media and say, okay, the things that I'm seeing that I find so horrifying, they're seeing it too. That feels good to me.
Yeah, there was something really interesting to me. I remember watching the show, and I get to a point, I think it's about partway through season 1, and realized, oh, the villain is capitalism here. And that's kind of the focus of season 1, and then it changes in others. But the idea of, we've seen different media that explores what would happen in a world where superpowered people were. But this was the first one. I know it's not just the show, it also goes back to the comic, that really sort of posited the not as interesting, not as flashy, but probably much more realistic. The big things that happen is that capitalism would build a machine out of it, the way it has with so many other things.
And that would backfire in a million ways, as, go figure, it has with many other things. There's a line in Scott Jordan's chapter that is, looking at who are the villains and exploring all the different villains in the show. And eventually there's a line that says, so who is the real villain in The Boys? It's Vought. It's the corporation. And I just thought, yeah, that really says it all. That's what makes this show really different.
I think that's such an interesting point. And I really want to get into this whole question of who is the villain and who is, and how are they presented? Because I think it's a topic that both and also some of your authors go back to again and again. But I know the other theme that seems to come up all the time in this, which is, I think, deeply linked to The Boys, but also to so much of superhero media, is masculinity and what kind of images of masculinity we're putting forth. So Matthew, Dr. Snyder, and Lena, earlier, I apologize, I should also refer to you as Dr. Zubernis. But Matthew, what is it about this show's approach to masculinity and the dangers of it, the dangers of toxic masculinity, but also the dangers of healthy masculinity that really kind of drew you in?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's such an interesting question, and I think The Boys does such a great job of kind of looking at the backstory, like how did people get where they are, like how did Homelander become the person that he is, and in that way, we may demonize or villainize or think of him as a villain, but is he kind of a product of his upbringing, his experience, and he didn't have a mother or a father. He was kind of like, growing up in a laboratory kind of thing. But some of the most interesting kind of concepts around that are like, what do we teach our young men and women, or what do we teach specifically our young men about what is right, what is wrong, how to get our needs met, and how do we care for or care about others? And in kind of my chapter, I talk a lot about like the themes, the values that we kind of instill, and what's shown through The Boys, but also in our American culture, is this idea of I come first, you come second. You have to be strong and independent and masculine, and power is what it's all about. And power kind of equates to privilege, and other people don't really matter. Other people are kind of there just to get our needs met. And maybe some of it's subtle, in kind of the values that are Americanized, and sometimes it's very kind of very out there and very realistically portrayed. Especially, obviously, Homelander is kind of the lightning rod for a lot of this toxic masculinity, but also there's Butcher and he says a lot of stuff like, "Hey, Daddy's home," those kinds of things, or he'll kind of disparage female body parts as being, you don't want to be a PUSSY, and it's funny because then you have Huey saying, well, actually, I don't mind being called that. That's a pretty, strong, realistic, thing. And I don't know why you think that's such a bad thing to be called. But that's where kind of toxic masculinity kind of grows from.
Right.
No, I think that's really interesting. And I also really like Matt's chapter for what it says about Huey and his struggle with toxic masculinity, because we all, whether we're identify as male or female or neither, like we all absorb the same messages about what masculinity should be and what it should look like. And Huey's journey is so interesting because he absorbs all of that and he believes all of that. And so he initially sees his dad as not masculine and not doing things the way he should, and weak and ineffective. And he really sort of has disdain for his dad in a lot of ways. But then over time, he has that great moment that Matt writes about in his chapter where he sort of has that revelation of, oh, my dad being willing to sit with me and make me Hot Pockets and talk about my feelings after my mom left, like that was masculinity. That was healthy masculinity. That was not weakness. That was strength, and him giving me that strength. So I love Yui's journey. There's a couple chapters specifically on Yui's journey that talk about his struggle against that toxic masculinity.
Yeah. One thing I hadn't really put together until I read through your book, and I forget which one of the authors kind of highlights this, but is that, there's a lot that's said about how Huey feels, and I use this term because it's the term that's used within toxic masculinity, even though I think it is by definition problematic, but he feels emasculated in some way by the fact that he is dating this woman who is a superhero and can do amazing feats of strength that he cannot. And I remember when I was watching that, I was speaking to, I am non-binary, but I've been masculine raised and masculine presenting, and having some level of identification with that insofar as, my partner makes 5 times the money that I do. And economic strength is often measured almost as high as physical strength in that way. And so identifying with that, to be sure, although, realizing the problematicness of all of that, but also that the story starts with Huey with another partner, his first partner, Robin, who is killed in front of him, and there is literally nothing he could do. It happens instantaneously, but still somewhere in that masculine lizard brain, there's got to be the thought of, I couldn't protect her, and now I can't protect Starlight, and now I can't, and just there's something so brilliant about how that parallel was set up. He never says to Starlight, I couldn't protect Robin, so I have to protect you. But if you really look at it, it's definitely there.
Well, if you continue to take that arc, Matthew, like he gets to a point where he takes Compound V.
Right. Yeah.
Right. So like you could see this beautiful arc of him struggling with this and also like Starlight and even Butcher not wanting Huey to kind of change, right, into what he became. So there's that great, scene where they have to kind of save Huey because he's, he's beaten up after the asylum attack. And Huey keeps saying stuff like, well, the good guy doesn't win. You have to kind of be mean. You have to be dirty. You have to fight dirty. And that's when he decides to take the Compound V. So, Lynn and I talk a lot about this. I'm sure, you can kind of share your thoughts, Lynn, but, Butcher gets really upset when Huey takes the Compound V, because he realizes that Huey is really kind of the standing up for what masculine should be. And Butcher feels like he's kind of let Huey down and led him down this dark path.
Yeah, there's one of the chapters in the book refers to Huey as Butcher's canary, which is something that it is said in the show. And I think Butcher really does realize that. Like, Huey and Butcher's journey is entwined throughout the show. And a lot of it is about both of their struggle of, who am I as a man and what should I have been able to do? Both of them were unable to protect their original partner, who happened to be a woman. Both of them, that shaped their feelings about, who am I if I couldn't do this? They both bought into those toxic masculinity tropes that are out there. And I think taking the Compound V, it does feel so pivotal because it's almost like, if you're taking the Compound V, you are embracing what toxic masculinity says you should be. You're going to be violent. You're going to be strong. You're going to protect weaker people. That is your purpose as a man when you take it.
Yeah.
I think it's interesting if you parallel that with Kimiko's struggle with Compound V. It's not about toxic masculinity, but the struggle is actually very similar. Do I allow myself to be human and have the vulnerability that comes with being human? Or do I, in some sense, buy into these tropes of violence, the same ones that toxic masculinity talks about, in order to be able to protect people I love? In this case, like Frenchie. So I also love, The Boys never does anything in a simplistic, overly simplistic way. There's so much complexity there between gender and power and violence and the intersection of all those things. And I love that it doesn't come to any interesting, simple conclusions about that.
Yeah. No, it's very true. And you talk in your chapter about the sort of ending fight of season 3 between Homelander and Soldier Boy. And I think you talked about how I felt, and like we don't know who to root for. Like who do we want to win? And I'm going to get more into villains as you describe them, the kitten murder, the baby murder kittens, which is one of my favorite phrases from the book. But I just want to say kind of one other thing on the toxic masculinity point. In kind of a funny intersection, earlier today I was strolling through TikTok, and there was a TikTok that a friend of mine had done, Neighborhood Master Allen. He's a martial artist with lightsabers. He makes lightsabers and sells them. He's been on this podcast, on my sister podcast, the Star Wars Universe podcast. And someone had put up, a question to be stitched of, why do men always have photographs of them with a fish that they caught in their dating profile pictures? And I think it's a good thing to make fun of, and there's all sorts of stuff there. But Alan made this incredible connection that I had never really thought of in that regard, which is that men are taught that we're valued for what we do, not what we are. And that kind of led to this whole thing that I have, by the time this podcast comes out, because we're going to wait till the actor strike is over, maybe a couple more weeks or months, but I'm going to probably want to put in a couple of TikToks about this, about how in my own journey, when I started wanting to take more selfies of myself, it was such this mental hurdle to get past, because I always have seen my value in what I do, not in just what I are. How do you think that plays into all of this? Because as you said, it kind of Huey can't. Starlight, I remember, tries to tell Huey that he's good and a good partner to her because of who he is, and he can't hear that. It has to be about what he does.
Mm-hmm. Go ahead, Lynn, and then I'll follow you this time.
What strikes me about that, too, is I instantly, when you talked about those photos of men with the fish they caught, which is, it can be a meme forever because we've all seen it so many times. But that's also explicitly saying that one of the roles by which men should define their identity is being a provider. Catching fish is about providing. It's the same reason why, as you said, it can feel really weird if you are not bringing in as much economic support to a family as your partner is, if you identify as a man, or even if you were just raised as a man amidst these tropes. Mm-hmm. So I think that's part of it too. And I think that's part of Huey's struggle also, that he wants to buy into this whole entire narrative that he's absorbed all his life. He wants to be successful in some way, however you define that. And you see it in Soldier Boy's struggle too. In my chapter on Soldier Boy, which is very much about toxic masculinity also, his father was very economically successful, very powerful man because of his economic success. And his expectation for his son was that he was going to be successful too. Not that he was going to be a screw up at school and, it's insinuated he doesn't do well. Maybe he was at risk of flunking out. So part of Ben's original reason for signing up to take Compound V was to be more successful. That's another piece of this.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, it's so interesting. Don't forget, I'm blanking on the doctor that helped Homelander grow up, Dr. Vogelbaum, thank you. It was on the tip of my tongue. But don't forget, there's that great scene where he talks about teaching Homelander about manifest destiny. Mm-hmm. And this American concept of, I can take shit from others because, God said it's okay. So I think that goes right into what you're saying. Even if you take it a step farther, not only are we kind of defined by what we do, but there's kind of this not a God-given right, but this is what men are put on the earth to do, is to, grab power and prestige and build and conquer and take from others and build from the ground. And this whole idea of manifest destiny, they talk about it very briefly, but it's such a core concept in toxic masculinity and also the boys. And look, Homelander's willing to pretty much laser through millions of people to get what he wants. And he thinks it's fine, mm-hmm. right? There's this nihilism along with manifest destiny. I don't care about anybody else. right? I'm going to get my needs met regardless. I'm going to be bigger, faster, stronger. I'm going to have a bigger house, or I'm going to take from others. And that's actually not bad. That's okay. That's manifest destiny. I'm meant for great things.
Right. Yeah, there's a very ends justify the means kind of aspect to it all. That is right.
I talk about that in my chapter, right? At what end and at what cost.
Right.
And
Very much so.
there's also the piece of that too. I mean, I love that The Boys makes very explicit and sort of a concrete example of something which is actually really a very abstract thing so that we can actually see it and talk about it. Vogelbaum talks about how initially Homelander, before he was Homelander, as a boy, was very sensitive and very kind. Like he was actually born as someone with personality traits that didn't line up with toxic masculinity, and his raising, training, socialization, whatever you want to call it, purposely and intentionally kind of force that out of him. But that is the same thing that happens in reality. It's not as overt because people aren't locked in labs and only being influenced by one person. But that is the way the societal messages shape people's minds into, oh, I can't be this kind of a sensitive person. I can't be a sensitive, caring, kind boy. That is not how I'm supposed to be. And hasn't that gotten us in a whole lot of crappy situations?
In some ways, I think the show does a great job of letting Huey be the audience point of view character for the most part, because you get to go on that journey with him. Because, the relationship between him and Butcher is more, older, younger brother, but there's definitely an aspect of Butcher represents the kind of masculinity that his father does not. And that for you as the viewer at first, you're like, yeah, his father just wants to roll over and let the company walk all over him, and Butcher wants to fight back, and isn't that great? Mm-hmm. We're talking a lot about how this all affects the men in all of this, and I want you to talk a little bit more about how, there's so much to Maeve and Starlight's characters and a number of the other women characters, not just toxic masculinity, but just on the subject, because there's some great stuff in the book about how both Starlight and Queen Maeve wind up being both kind of obviously victims of or harmed by the toxic masculinity of those around them, but also kind of enculturated into that culture, especially Queen Maeve. Talk more about that.
Yeah, because it happens to, we all absorb toxic masculinity and misogyny and homophobia and everything else. We all absorb it, whether it's directly relevant, those messages coming to us, whether we identify as the target of those messages or not, we all buy into them. And there's numerous examples of how the people who identify as women in the show also buy into that. Stormfront is another great example, or Madeline Stillwell. We have tons of examples of how people buy into that too. But I like that, again, I think my favorite arcs in the show are watching people, Supes or regular people, struggle against these tropes. So Maeve's journey, we know from what we hear about her history that she started out really authentic to herself, authentically wanting to help, maybe kind of naive about what being a Supe was all about. And then she finds out. And at first, or for a while, she decides to buy into those tropes. She wants the power. She wants the popularity. She feels like this is the only option that she has. So she's very cynical when the show starts. She says to Starlight, stop crying, wipe your makeup off. Like, this is what we have to do. But over the course of the show, she reverts back to realizing the value of her relationship with her girlfriend, for example, and that's actually more important to her than being a Supe that has a theme park modeled after you, or by being sort of the poster person for being lesbian, which she isn't even, like just completely being something for someone else that you're not, even though you do get clear benefits for that. And that is also real. There are real world benefits for buying into the way that you should be, even if a part of you knows, this is really not the way I should be. This is not really right. So I love that she has to struggle for 3 whole seasons to get back to that authenticity and to be willing to say, you know what? I'm done. I'm done with this. I have my humanity back. You know, I'm going to go be happy with Elena. I love that journey.
Mm-hmm. And there's so much there to unpack, but I just want to say it quickly. I love that you lifted up the way the company responds when she comes out about being in a queer relationship with Elena, because it is that very, like, at the time that happened, I don't remember where, if it was because Pride was coming up or Pride had just happened or what the schedule was, but there were conversations going on about how Pride is becoming more corporate, you know, and that more and more corporations are embracing Pride, which, you know, I remember when the corporations were throwing rocks at us. Like, it is progress in some ways, but there's also something very insidious about how capitalism can just be like, oh, okay, instead of hating, that can make us money, let's take that now. And it was like 5 seconds of on screen, but having Maeve's being in a relationship with a woman, first being reduced to being lesbian, which is, you know, one sapphic relationship does not define that, but also she's a queer woman necessarily, but I think she identifies as bi, but also that just the way that the corporation just made that their own as a profit thing, it was 5 seconds of screen time and brilliant social commentary.
Yeah, and again,
and look what happened with like Bud Light, like after that, like if you like talk about like it's so funny, and you can point to many things where Kripke or the writers, there's such a commentary about our society and our American culture right now, and sometimes they even like call things before they happen, and sometimes they're holding a mirror up to what's happening now, but. Don't forget, like, the Bud Light thing happened after, you know, this all came. So, like, you're so right on, Matthew, with that. They're just using it as a way to kind of save money and or to make money. And as soon as they weren't making money, like, they dropped that like a hot rock. It's not like there's something that intuitively and ethically they're going to stand behind. It's all a manipulation for power and privilege.
And just to be clear, because I think there's been a couple of things that might qualify, by the Bud Light thing, you mean that one of their spokespeople at one point was Dylan Mulvaney, I think is the name.
Yes.
A very popular trans woman who is an influencer, and that caused just a huge backlash that Bud Light then backed away from some. And just want to make sure.
And to keep going on with that, Matthew, now Bud Light is kind of like, now they're back on the, you know, football. Like, I was watching some football this weekend, which I enjoy doing. And of course, Bud Light's back on it's all about football and manly. And so like they'll swing that pendulum wherever they feel like they can make the buck. And I think, you know, that's what the boys kind of holds up, that they'll manipulate, like, and again, it's Vought that's manipulating it, which is, you know, kind of the true villain. And then the other thing I wanted to talk about is like, people feel so stuck. Like if you look at, especially the female characters, they almost feel like they have to play the game the toxic masculinity way, which is what Lynn was talking about. And they'll use whatever power or privilege they can, whether it's sexuality, whether it's breast milk. I mean, there's so many kind of things that go into that narrative. It's so interesting. They feel like the only way to kind of not win the game, but even have a stake in it is to play the way that you have to play in a toxic masculinity sense.
There's been a lot of great analysis that I've been seeing recently about how people in situations where they're being oppressed, where there are power structures that work against them, you know, kind of talking about not necessarily what is the right thing or the wrong thing, but what are they doing to survive? And, you know, what are they doing in a situation where, you know, they perceive that they have no choice to do this, either out of literal fear of their life or out of this is the only way they can succeed, this is the only way they can get out of the traps they're in. I feel like that's, as you said, from everything from Marilyn to Starlight's decision with the Deep to Maeve's kind of, you know, subsuming so much of herself. It's all survival.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I like that another consistent theme that runs throughout The Boys is the intergenerational transmission of all these things, because it's not even just what you experience in your own life. It's not just that you learn these things by stepping in it once or twice and then saying, "Oh shit, I better not do that again." It is something that is explicitly and intentionally passed down through the generations. You see it with Soldier Boy's father. You see it with Dr. Vogelbaum, the Homelander. You see it with Annie's mother, that she just as in, Annie's not in a lab. She's not being abused in any traditional way, but her mother decides that the best thing for her and the way she can be successful and maybe even the way she can be safe in life, her mother might even have believed that, is for her to turn her into a soup, feed her a narrative about how she got that way, which was untrue, absorb Annie's father's leaving in order to keep that narrative supported, and then explicitly tell her, you have to suck it up. This is what's expected. Even if you're in pain, you have to smile and put on this skimpy outfit and go out there and be this persona that we've created. And her mother seems to have, in the beginning, really convinced herself through rationalization or whatever other process that this is actually the best thing for her daughter too, which is really heartbreaking to see. But that's why it's perpetuated, because people do start to believe, I'm doing this because this is the right thing to do.
I remember when that storyline came out, another people who I follow, another community that I'm very involved in, is ex-evangelicals. People, I myself am Christian. I'm a former pastor. I was never raised in that. I've always been a very progressive side of things. But, for obvious reasons, I connect a lot with people who have really been fighting against the much more conservative sides of the church. And the number of women in those communities, especially those who were part of modeling circuits or, singing or doing other things where their physical attractiveness was pushed, so related to that, and really related to, among other things, this incredible confusion of, we want to dress you in these very skimpy outfits while we push this message of virginity and celibacy, and which those two things can absolutely go hand in hand, to be very clear. But they have the way it was being pushed on them instead of being chosen for them, as well as just this idea. And I thought there was something so brilliant in that Starlight faces this double rejection from the two strong women who she looks to for help, Queen Maeve and her mother. And both of them, in some regard, are just saying, like, I don't want to know. This is what you got to deal with. As you said, suck it up and deal with it. Mm-hmm. And what Starlight goes through comes from a character, the Deep, who he is such a great example of the other kind of big thing I wanted to talk about, which is the way villains are treated and then redeemed or not redeemed, or however you want to discuss it. In that, the Deep does something. He sexually assaults Starlight. He compels her into performing an act on him that she clearly does not consent to because of the power dynamic. And then by the end of the third season, they've given us all these reasons to feel sympathetic for him. And I remember it being a real struggle where I was like, don't want to root for this character, but I find myself that I am in some ways. And I think you perfectly summed it up with the kitten murder baby phrase. What is a kitten murder baby?
It's a character that we intellectually know rationally is a villain, is a bad person, is not somebody we should root for. And yet at the same time, they have certain characteristics and they have a backstory that we know about that's sympathetic. So we find ourselves rooting for them anyway. But it's jarring because it's the rational part of our brain warring with the emotional part of our brain. So we see it with Soldier Boy. That's what my chapter was about. That's how I refer to him. And that's how much of the fandom was referring to him too. It happens with the Deep also. The show is really good at not painting anything in black and white. It is the most shades of gray show I think I have ever seen, because even the people who we know are supposed to be the villains, other than Vought, the Supes that we know are supposed to be the villains, they do such a great job of telling us and showing us how they got there, and also showing us bits of their vulnerability that we feel pulled to forgive them for the terrible things that we absolutely know they've done, and to treat them as little baby murder kittens, even though we know that they are perhaps vicious killers or rapists or something else sometimes.
Yeah, Frenchie's a great example of that, right? Like, you really want to root for Frenchie, and he shares such kind of a soft side, and he's cooking and he's caring for Kimiko. But don't forget, like, he pushed drugs and was in gangs, and and yet he had horrible things happen to him. I mean, his dad did horrible things to him. So, like, it's interesting. I think that goes into what Lynn's saying is, like, we're always taught as psychologists, everything happens for a reason. Our job is not to judge it. Our job is to understand why.
Right.
And if you take that viewpoint for the boys, boy, do they really try to tell you why somebody does the things that they do. And not that makes it okay, but we really get a good realization of where how these people got where they are.
Yeah. And I think that's such an important part of this discussion, because I think where the discussion often breaks down a lot, and I love what you said about that you want to understand without excusing it necessarily or judging it, or somebody maybe judging it, is what I refer to as, like, is this an explanation or is this an excuse? Because something I think we see in fandom all the time, and a lot of this comes from the person I would happily apply the term, baby murder kitten to in a very different fandom that I'm not sure how you're involved in, but Anakin Skywalker. In all of that. And
sure,
there are, I think, incredibly nuanced, interesting discussions to be had about to what extent is what Anakin did, his own choices versus the way he was manipulated by Palpatine versus the way he was treated as a young child, all of that in terms of, as you said, explanations. But instead, the discussion clearly comes down to, it wasn't his fault. He's still a perfect guy. He was just he was groomed by Palpatine, or he was ignored by Mace Windu.
Right.
There's often some unfortunate race connotations there when Mace is blamed or whatever it is. And I'm not going to make you talk about Star Wars, but using that as an example, I'd love to hear more about how is it you see this play out in fandom, where with character, like, it feels like having that kind of idea of, I can root for someone like Soldier Boy, I can sympathize with him without necessarily excusing him. In the world of Twitter and TikTok, that nuance is often lost, and it quickly becomes, no, it's not Homelander's fault, it's Vogelbaum's. No, it's not Soldier Boy's fault. How does that kind of play out as you see it?
I think part of what is happening in fandom, and having studied fandom for 20 years now, fandom has changed a lot, just as humans have changed a lot over the last 20 years. I think that there is an increasing number of people who really struggle with the very thing that The Boys is trying to put out there, which is nuance and shades of gray. Like, The Boys is explicitly telling you as a human are capable of feeling two things at once. We actually can do that. It's uncomfortable, but we can do it. And it's actually an important skill that humans need to have. As therapists, as psychologists, that's something we work with our clients around, because people have kind of a knee-jerk reaction of, I can't both dislike what this person is doing and also feel bad for this person because what's happened to them. Yes, you actually can. It just takes some comfort with that. And I think for a lot of fans, that is not possible. So the only way they can deal with the affectionate feelings that they are feeling for a fictional character is to recode everything that has happened to that character as not just explanation, but excuse. The only way they can allow themselves to feel the warm part of that feeling is by blocking out or denying or by rationalizing away everything else that character has done. That's not what The Boys is trying to tell you to do by any means. That's not what Star Wars is trying to tell you to do by any means. And maybe this is me being a fandom old, but it seems like fandom used to be able to handle that nuance and that black and white, and maybe just not take the whole thing quite as seriously when we're talking about fictional characters. But now there's such a disconnect with people really mixing up almost how they feel about fictional characters with how, as though these things were happening in the real world. And thus, they need to have a more black and white view of morality. I do think that's a change, and I actually think it's kind of a disturbing change.
As another old fogey, my temptation to say, it's you can't have nuance in a 160 character tweet, but I think there's a lot of other reasons for it. But yeah, I think that there's definitely some truth there.
Yeah. Matthew, I'd be happy to talk about Star Wars all day. My son Adam, it's his. It's
thing. My son too. My son's thing too.
Yeah, and
congratulations, you just volunteered to be on another podcast. But go on.
But I think the thing that's so interesting about Anakin, and that's my son Adam's favorite character, and I think he relates to him a lot. Mm-hmm. Right? How would I react, or how do? And that's the thing, and Lynn took the words right out of my mouth. It's called the dialectic. Like, two things can be present kind of at the same time. I mean, there's a whole freaking therapy about it, dialectical behavioral therapy. I can both love and hate somebody. I can both, I can want to be something and still be okay with where I am. And I think that's the struggle, is like, I can't be a person that likes Anakin, even though I want to like Anakin, because he's such, look, he slaughtered all these kids. Like, but I really want to like him, and I'm like, it's okay. Yeah, you can like and hate the same character, right? And that's life. I mean, we don't all do things that are great, right? We can embrace parts of ourselves and look at other parts of ourselves and say, yeah, that's probably not the best part of me, but that doesn't mean I'm a bad person. It means that those are the things I need to work on. There's another thing that we say a lot in therapy: there's no failure, only feedback. Right? Like, you don't have to say, well, oh my God, you're a horrible person because you did this. Like, hey, like, this is something you're doing or that you did. And what do we make of that? And how do we move from that? We cannot live in the past. Yeah. And so I think that's a lot of what you're talking about, Matthew.
I really think so. And I love the way you put that. I'm not a trained therapist the way either of you are, but I'm a former pastor. As part of that, we had some, introduction to therapy and the like. And because we're often dealing with people who we're generally, the goal is like, all right, you see us once or twice, and then please go see a therapist, because all that. But one of the things I think that became so important to the work I would often do with people that I think is really underlying all this is our culture loves blame. And it's not just our culture, but also our brains, And I know I've dealt with this myself, and a lot of others I know have dealt with this, and I think DBT is a great way of addressing this a lot of ways. But it's very hard. The idea of two people had a conflict, and they both had some fault in it, and they got into a cycle that fed off of each other. That's really hard to accept. What's a lot easier to accept is either A, I was the bad guy, so I have to punish myself or I have to change myself, or they were the bad guy. They're my crazy ex, and now I can blame all of them. Mm-hmm. And maybe I'm wrong here, but it feels like that is a lot of it's good that we're paying more attention to that, but that's kind of some of the dynamic that we're now having in fandom a lot, is it's very hard to say, look, this explains what Homelander is and who Homelander is and why he is, and we can learn from this to prevent future Homelanders, but that doesn't stop or justify the harm that a Homelander or a Soldier Boy or someone creates. Do you think there's somebody who said for that's part of what feeds into this idea of we need to excuse it because of but because it's not, Vought is to blame, capitalism is to blame, and thus it's not this other person.
Right. Matthew, take it a step farther. I talk a lot about this in my chapter. It's like, it's so interesting. What The Boys does on some level is say, if we took normal people and made them superheroes, how would they turn out? Mm-hmm. Right? So we have these neurotic, we have these people that are good, bad, or have different bad, and basically we're turning them into superheroes, and we're saying, what do they do with all this power? And I think Butcher says, I think it's season 3, something about power corrupts, automatically or, without fail. And that's really it's such an interesting concept. If we were superheroes, if somebody gave us this compound V, first, would we take it? And second, what will we do with that power and privilege? Will we be nihilists? Will we be narcissists? That's kind of the arc of almost everybody that takes it. Yeah. Right. So it's such an interesting question.
And has so much to say about capitalism too, right? If you give the power and privilege to only a few, can we really depend on those few to,
Yeah.
to have things trickle down to? No, what this show is saying is absolutely you cannot. In fact, the more power and privilege you give them, the greater the chances that they're going to do something really shitty to everyone else because they can.
It's so true. And one thing I love so much about Homelander and Soldier Boy especially is that they're such perfect parallels for Superman and Captain America. I mean, down to like the cape and the shield. And with both of those characters, and part of why I started this podcast is because I'm much more a Batman guy than a Superman guy, because I've always felt that the fundamental idea behind Batman is you can have someone who is that powerful and that good and could turn bad, but he's just so wholesome, Kansas, right person that you can trust him with the power. And that's the same thing with Captain America of, you can't trust the government, you have to let him trust himself. And there's something really heartwarming about those stories, and I think there's some hope that there's a reason to have those stories. But this is the flip side. This is what if Superman, because that's Homelander is Superman, just without all the wholesome, in many ways, I feel like if Lex Luthor were to watch The Boys, he'd be like, that's why I'm afraid of Superman. That's Amanda Waller would be like, this is why I keep kryptonite, because it takes kind of mixing all the metaphors now, but the Joker idea of even a Superman is just one bad day away from being a Homelander.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's a chapter that refers to the Supes as sentient nukes, and raises the question of, can you ever control sentient nukes? And when you give people too much power, are they all? That's what they are, and they may keep that contained. They may never act out and do anything, but there's an awareness that power is there and it could be destructive at any time. I also think that Yui's whole journey with, taking the compound V and who do I want to be? I mean, that is a little bit of the more traditional, Yui does really want to hang on to his humanity. Queen Maeve also. Some of the stories here are reflecting that not everybody is going to do everything for power and let it take away their humanity and let them hurt other people. But a lot of people are. So again, it's not black and white. I think they're showing both sides, but they're also showing just how tempting it is and all the reasons we want to buy into that. Yeah.
And to me, that's especially when you said the word tempting, that's the Star Wars story for me. That's the whole idea of the dark side of that, you want to do good. And so you want more and more power and where they can go. And the sentient nuke thing to me really rings true because we don't have people with that kind of physical superpower. But Elon Musk is basically that, those people who just have that kind of power. Let's talk about how gender plays into this a bit, because we're talking specifically about male heroes a lot. And I hear a similar version of this around evil women characters, or supervillains and the like. And a phrase that gets tossed around a lot in the queer queer fandoms I listen to and participate in is, I support women's rights, but I also support women's wrongs. And the idea of, I'm rooting for this woman either sometimes because it's, what she's doing is enacting a revenge fantasy of, she's doing villainous things but fighting back against toxic masculinity or capitalism. I think the Harley Quinn cartoon really kind of digs into this, but also just an article of she's damn sexy and I love her doing it and I'm going to support it. This also ties into the other thing I want to ask about, which is the sexuality of these characters and how we respond to it. But I'm just kind of curious, how do you see either similarities or differences in how relatable, sympathetic male villains are treated versus sympathetic, relatable female villains?
I mean, they don't have as many female quote unquote villains. Certainly Stormfront comes to mind as the character that this most plays out around. I think one of the most interesting things about Stormfront, who we do have a chapter on and an interview, a whole exclusive interview with Aya Cash, because I am pretty fascinated with that character. I think it's really interesting that in the beginning, all of her sort of stereotypically attractive female qualities, like she's social media savvy and she seems to be like calling out Vought for their hypocrisy, and she seems to be very much like take down the man and female empowerment for real. And we really buy into that. If you haven't read the comics anyway, we really buy into that when we first meet her. And it's very interesting that they gender switched her. In the comics, Stormfront was a male character. They made her into a female character, which I think makes it a lot more complicated. And it was very jarring to realize, oh, wait a minute. This actually is not a character that we're supposed to be rooting for. This character actually is a villain character. I think it's also interesting that the final kind of takedown of Stormfront happens with the women. They allow the women characters to be the one who actually takes Stormfront out. So I do think it's trying to say something about how, women buy into the same tropes of toxic masculinity, and women are just as capable as men of getting a lot of power and using it for bad. I mean, I think it's a very equal playing field, but I think also this show, it tries to be very careful about remembering that there is an inherent power differential between women and men in this particular culture, and that was a very interesting choice to have the women be the one who took Stormfront down.
Definitely. And there's so much more to say about Stormfront, especially in that, like, in this world of nuance, I feel like making her explicitly a Nazi is kind of a way of saying, okay, everyone is nuanced, but she is a villain, like, straight up, by attaching her not as a metaphor, but directly to, one of the most obvious, embodiments of evil in our own world. But I apologize. I think I should phrase the question a little differently. I guess what I'm more saying is I'm curious your thoughts on how this plays out of sort of the sexy male villain and the sexy female villain in the larger kind of superhero cultures, and the choice in the boys to make it specifically about that most of the murder kitten babies are male is more kind of what I'm getting at, because it does feel to me like the culture around sexy female villain is often somewhat different than the murder baby kitten. But yeah, I guess that's more kind of what I'm getting at. But I'd love to hear either of you talk about.
Yeah, Matt, what do you say? I feel like you can do a better job of answering this, especially for the wider superhero world.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think, Matthew, you bring up a good point in that, I mean, even if you look at, Star Wars, and you talked a little bit about that, like, there really aren't a lot of, female villains, and even if they are, they're not really fleshed out to the depth of, like a Darth Vader or Darth Sidious or something like that. But if you look at the boys, I think it's really interesting. I think you really look at that manifest destiny aspect, and you think of, like, societal concepts, and I think that's where the men are quote unquote supposed to be. So I feel like The Boys does a very good job of women always trying to figure out where their place is, and the men not giving them any space.
Yeah.
Right, Kimiko, right, Stormfront. I mean, and Stormfront has this great line, and I'm gonna butcher it, I'm sure, but, like, it's basically like, I don't need 100,000 followers, I need 10,000 kind of maniacs. And I think that's what she's kind of struggling with, is like, how do I find my power? How do I find my privilege? Who will let me in the game? Right. So to speak, because men are never letting them in the game. Kimiko's another great example of that, right? Like, being used by males. Right, being brought over and stuck with needles, and so men have this manifest destiny. We're supposed to, be powerful and privileged and tell people what to do, and there's really no room for women to play that role.
I think there's also, I mean, obviously internalized misogyny. It affects all of us. It affects women. It affects men. It affects everyone. And I do think when you look at fandom tends to be much more forgiving of male characters than female characters being villains. And part of that is because misogyny is internalized in all of us. So you see much more, oh, well, but he, and you see a lot less of that, oh, well, but she. It's interesting because I think sometimes I'm a bit of an anomaly in that I usually feel that same kind of, oh, but you got to think about the fact that she, more than other people, for example, I felt really upset when all the women were like totally railing on Stormfront. And I was very aware that I was not supposed to feel upset, that I was supposed to feel like, yeah, she's getting hers. But I was still upset at the violence of it and at what was happening. I was upset at the horrible disfiguring thing that happened to her. I latched onto the little bit of backstory that we did get. I latched onto her vulnerability and humanity about her daughter, who she had connected to, and the fact that she was trying to recreate a family with Homelander and Ryan, even though she actually was a literal Nazi. I actually brought that up to Aya in our interview, and she was kind of surprised. She said, I don't think that's what most people feel about this character. I don't think they feel any sense of forgiveness for her at all. But really, is she a whole lot worse than Homelander? And we feel a lot of forgiveness and a lot of excusing for him. So I think some of that is the difference between a male villain and a female villain.
Let me ask you a question then, Lynn. I think Soldier Boy even more gets more excuses. So if you think of like Stormfront and then Homelander, like, boy, are people forgiving of Soldier Boy? Why do you think that is?
I mean, a little bit of that at least. And I said this to Eric Kripke and he kind of agreed. A little bit of that at least is what Matthew said in the very beginning. He's played by Jensen Ackles, who has a lot of fans and is extremely nice to look at and also is just a really good actor. So when he's going to show you the vulnerability of that character, you are really going to see the vulnerability of that character.
Yeah.
And yet he treats women very poorly. I mean, if you look at the flashback where they're in the jungle of, wherever, Asia or wherever, he has some of the most horrific lines of toxic masculinity in the whole show.
He for sure does, but he also has these adorable little moments where he's like singing a song on a TV show and just being ridiculous.
But that's my point, is that like that's boys being boys, right? And that's excusable.
And this is how it happens in real life too. I mean, we see it all the time.
That's what I'm saying.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I love how you point out in his chapter that he, among other things, he treats them in still very misogynistically kind of sex object ways, but it's older women who he is, has this threesome with. I think they're workers at the hotel he's at, and he refers to them as aging like a fine wine, and it's this nice like, oh, he's not the 35-year-old dating the 18-year-old model, but also still wrapped up in all the other stuff, and I think that. I have to imagine, and you all might know this better than I, but the kind of, I think we're being a lot more critical of it now, but obviously there's been in society and in psychology a lot of the kind of like, well, the response to the bad man is, I can fix him. He just needs the love of a good woman. And I feel like that, to me, I guess that was kind of where, part of what I was thinking about in terms of the gender breakdown is that I think you don't see that as much with the Scarlet Witch, or with Poison Ivy as much. It's a very different kind of a dynamic, but that still there's that idea of like, oh, I could be the one to bring out the good side in Soldier Boy. I could be the one to make Butcher, put past his pain and be a good dad and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, which is really part of toxic masculinity and misogyny. Mm-hmm. I mean, we tend to look at female villains as more like she's inherently evil. She's the Wicked Witch. That is what she is. That's part of her identity. Whereas a male villain, we tend to be like, oh, well, these things happened to him. I'm sure I can fix him. I can forgive this and that. I do think it is different. I mean, I do think it is also changing and becoming like I think of like the narrative of something like Frozen, which is in a totally different genre, but or Wicked, like looking at female quote unquote villains as not something inherently evil, but starting to look at them in a more nuanced way.
Yeah, I think I don't know if you've seen the animated Harley show, but it's very much of that. It's Poison Ivy and Harley are doing horrible things, but they're doing horrible things to the capitalists who are ruining the economy and to men who, the misogyny culture of men whistling at women on the street is one that is horrific and needs to be undone. I don't think it means that those men should be instantly beheaded, as Harley and Poison Ivy do. But I think that the revenge fantasy aspect of that is a big part of what people can tie into there.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, no, I think so too.
Mm-hmm. Well, this has been a great conversation, and we're going to have a little bit more in a member section. But for either of you, is there any kind of aspects of this? You wrote a whole book about it, obviously, so saying what's the one last thing you want to say? But is there one other aspect of the way The Boys plays out psychologically that you kind of wanted to bring up?
Yeah. There's a couple. I'll just do one and then let Matt do one. I mean, I think he would agree with me that one of the things that we really appreciated about the show is, as psychologists, we see a lot of media not get it right when they're talking about mental health issues. And it's always annoying as a psychologist to say, that's perpetuating something that's totally not true and maybe is even harmful. I think The Boys often gets it very right. The show is very much about trauma. It's very much about loss. It's very much about the things that we absorb from our culture that are not good for us. And it shows the aftermath of that in a very realistic way. You know, characters don't experience trauma and have a nightmare one night and then get up the next day and say, okay, well, I'm putting that behind me. Like, they look at what happens with PTSD. They look at how people grieve and how sometimes that it goes awry for them sometimes. They look at how people are drawn to using substances to, try to get past some of these things. They look at the effect trauma has on people's relationships. I mean, they really don't shy away from making all this very realistic. And I think we both were drawn to the show because we appreciated that realism.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, I would definitely echo everything that Lynn said, and I would add the idea that just like if we have somebody, in front of us that we're doing therapy with, it's so nuanced, it's so complex. There is no right or wrong. There is no black and white. You can be many things at the same time, and I think that's what The Boys does so well. It really does talk about arcs. It talks about how people got where they are and also the choices that people make and that they have real consequences. And the other thing that I think is really interesting is the idea that people are just trying to get their needs met, mm-hmm. right? Whatever they particularly are. And they're, The Boys does such a fantastical, either they're blowing people up or they're lasering them in the face or whatever. But it's all because they're trying to get their needs met. And when they can't get their needs met, that's when distress happens.
Right. It's such a good point. And I particularly love what you're talking about there about the way the media will so often try to just diagnose these things automatically, and I think we see this all the time, both with, this character in fiction clearly has borderline or narcissistic personality disorder or whatever, but then also, open up any social media platform and within 5 clicks you can find something that says, 10 questions to see if your partner is a narcissist, or this kind of thing. And so often it's tied to a real demonization of these things. And I remember there was a period of it felt like about 10 or 15 years in the earlier 2000s where superhero media all of a sudden realized that just the mwahaha, I want power, I'm twirling my mustache villain isn't interesting enough. But they decided, okay, if we just give our villain PTSD, and then it shifted to if we just give them borderline or something else, then that explains why they're a villain and that's enough. And it was, for myself, I've talked openly about my own mental health journey. It's incredibly stigmatizing and the like, but also just deeply inaccurate. And so, yeah, I never really thought of it before, but I like the idea of The Boys being at least one of the ones that's trying to go a little deeper and say, yeah, there's trauma and there's mental health and all that, but it also there's so much more to it.
And they portray the mental health struggles of some of the most heroic characters on the show. You know, you see Starlight struggle with an eating disorder. You see Mother's Milk struggle with OCD. You see Yui struggle with, you know, trauma, PTSD, grief. I mean, it's not pathologizing. That's not all that they do. And yeah, it drives me crazy when I see those kind of things that you're talking about. So this feels so much better.
Yeah.
There's this thing, Matthew, that we call a phenomenological approach. And basically a phenomenological approach is basically every person is completely different. And you know, Lynn will probably agree with me. Like, I can count probably on the times that this has happened on one hand, maybe not even any, where somebody absolutely fits a specific diagnosis. Like, you know, everybody's, well, I'm borderline. Like, even the quote unquote borderlines I treat, they don't fit all the symptomology. Like, people are who they are. And even if they do hit it, tomorrow they might not, right? Like, maybe they're having a bad day. Like, we have to take people for who they are. And this idea that we're going to label them and therefore they're this way every day for the rest of their lives forever, and this is how they have to be categorized, is grossly inaccurate and I think a disservice to everybody that's trying to help people. The other thing that I think The Boys does is it normalizes all this stuff. Right? Like, you know, this is like, I don't know what abnormal is anymore. Like your experiences are your own and you know, whatever they are. And to judge them instead of saying, well, this is the impact your life has had on you, and to kind of accept that. And then what do we do with that? Do we move forward, or are there things we have to talk about? But that it's kind of a, you know, a very personal journal, and to pull out a book and say, well, this is what you fit, and therefore this is what you are. I mean, that's never the way that I've done therapy. I don't think it's the way that Lynn does, and most good therapists don't approach it that way.
Yeah,
in my opinion.
This is shifting genres quite dramatically, but I don't know if you've seen the show Crazy Ex-Girlfriend, but it does a lot. The name is off-putting for a lot of people, but I think it's actually one of the best explorations of borderline and psychology around that. And one of the things that it does is the character sings this song, it's a musical, when she's given a diagnosis. And she's like, oh, everything is cured. I've been given a label. I've been given an explanation. And then the whole next season is about her realizing, like, no, that's the start of a whole bunch of questions. That's not the answer. And yeah, I feel like it's the same kind of thing here.
I'll have to give it a watch. Yeah, that sounds very good and spot on.
It is very, very good. It's just, I had to be forced to watch it because the name was like, this sounds so misogynistic, but it's all about playing against that. Well, thank you both so much. For listeners, I hope they're going to be like, okay, well, this sounds like a great book. I want to know more. Give us your promo for the book. What is it? How do people find it, etc.?
It is a book full of all different perspectives on The Boys and why it is such a phenomenon and why it has resonated with so many people. It's got chapters by psychologists like we are as the editors, by sociologists, by entertainment professionals, by other creative media creators. It's got exclusive interviews with Jensen Ackles and Aya Cash and Jim Beaver and a lot of little interview clips from all the other main actors. So it really gives you all kinds of different perspectives on the show, what it was like to craft it and be part of it, what it's been like for all of us to watch it, and what particular things really spoke to us. So I think if the show speaks to you and resonates with you, that the book will really speak to you and resonate with you and definitely make you think, because all of the perspectives are different and they're all a deep dive. You can pre-order it if this is coming out before the first week of December at smartpopbooks.com/theboys. And if it is already December when you're hearing this, you can probably just pop over to your local bookstore or Amazon or Barnes & Noble and find it there.
Yep. And I have a deal with bookshop.org, which is a great organization that helps local bookstores. And so I'll make sure I have an affiliate link there. If you click to it, you can buy it from a local bookstore in your area. A little bit also helps go support this podcast. It is a great book. The two best endorsements of it that I can give, one is that I personally am very glad I'm polyamorous because both of my partners love the show. And when I got to the point that I was driving one of them crazy with how much I was like, oh my God, I never thought of this point. She was able to be like, go talk to Abby. Like, Abby also likes the show. I'm done with this. But the other thing is that, at a time when there is so much content I want to consume and I rarely go back and watch things, I'm now about halfway through season 1 of a rewatch because I felt like I was like, oh, okay, now I want to watch Homelander's introduction again. Now I want to watch the scene you were talking about with Stormfront and her kind of flashback scenes. It makes you want to watch the show again, which is it's a great thing. And if you listen to this podcast, it's probably because you find watching a piece of media not enough. You want to nerd out about it. You want to talk more about it. And it's one thing when you and your friends are talking about, oh, I read this one article that was written by someone who had talked to a psychologist once, so I'm an expert on this. This book is a chance to really listen to actual experts and perspectives that, as you said, it's not monolithic. People disagree with each other. People have different viewpoints, and it's as nuanced as the show itself, which is, I think, just fantastic. And I know both of you have also done other creations. So if people want to find more of what you have both done or how to find more about that, Dr. Zubernis, if you want to start.
Sure. You can find me on all social media at FangasmSPN. My own website is fangasmthebook.com. And you can find some of the books that I've written with the cast of Supernatural. If you're into that show, I have 2 books written with the actors. They all wrote their own chapters. You can find those books at peacewhenyouaredone.com.
Nice. And Dr. Snyder?
Yeah, most of my other stuff is textbooks and, related to clinical work. So probably not, the funnest things to read. And I kind of, I stay away from social media right now, just because, my main gig is kind of therapy. So I'm not really on those platforms. But if anybody, is looking for a good therapist in the Philadelphia area or in Pennsylvania, I do have openings. So
he's good.
That's wonderful to hear.
He's good.
That's wonderful to hear. And it's there's a whole other part of the conversation we didn't get into, but as a social media creator, one thing I really loved about the show is how it also talks about parasocial relationships and the way they can go. And so, yeah, I'm curious because I think a lot of people I know in helping professions avoid social media for exactly those kind of reasons. So, well, this has been wonderful. Thank you both so much. Thank you to Heather. I think you're your media person who helped get us in touch with each other. We'll love to have both of you back. As I said, there's a number of podcast ideas that we'd love to talk with you more about. To our fans, of course, want to hear what you have to think. I want to hear what you have to say. You can find all the information by going to theethicalpanda.com. You can also go to our webpage on True Story FM. We're part of that family of podcasts. There you'll find all my podcasts about this and about Star Wars, as well as other podcasts I've been a guest on. And most importantly, you'll find the way to reach out to us. We'd love to hear your feedback. What has been your experience of this? Does this make you interested in reading the book? What do you want to say? How do you feel about the stuff we talked about? Would love to hear it. Please check out all of that. Of course, if you're a member paying $5 a month, you get ad-free content, you get bonus content, you're supporting this podcast. This will probably come out after the strike has ended, but if you're doing that during the strike, 25% of all the money I get is going to the strike fund, so another great reason to support. So I have myself, my 2 wonderful guests. Members, stick around, but for everyone else, we have spoken.